Welcome to Tiny Art School, where I try to make art a little less intimidating, one tiny lesson at a time. Today, we're going to talk about Dadaism. I'm going to walk you through the foundations of Dadaism, including what it is, where it came from, the people who built it, the techniques that made it into a style, and what fingerprints did it still leave on modern society. Use the timestamps to jump ahead where you need the information. This video is great whether you're new to art, or you're just looking for a refresher, or you love history and you want to learn a little bit more about art history. Be sure to leave any questions for me in the comments section, and if you're not already, please subscribe. If you've ever walked into an art gallery, saw a piece of art, and thought, this isn't what art is supposed to be, congratulations, you had the exact same experience as people in the early 19th century experiencing Dadaism for the first time. Dadaism was less of an art style and more of a middle finger raised to society post World War I. Around 1916 is when it was technically born, and really it was saying if rationality is what brought us this bloodbath of World War I, then what is civilization, logic, or good taste worth to our society in the face of all the loss and proprietary nationalism? The movement aimed to be absurd for the sole intention of being strange and questioning what is taste. There are 5 essential hallmarks of Dadaism that we recognize as that art style. The first one is found objects portrayed as art. Famously, there was a urinal, there was also a bicycle, but essentially it could mean any object that you find, and you would be giving it an artistic meaning, whether the public thought it had one or not. Photo montage, which is a specific type of collage. It was really just a collection of images, usually from catalogs, magazines, and newspapers, that were arranged in comical composition and had a lot of things to say about feminism and humanity and nationality. They were often arranged in a way that it could seem uncomfortable or jarring, but that was the point. It was trying to get the viewer to question why we assume that there is a natural order of things. There was a writing movement that centered around nonsense. Literally, they would make up different languages and make up poetry. At the time, I think it was to say, what is the point of language if you can't communicate? And how absurd would that be if we're using language in a way that people don't understand? It's kind of echoing that even though we were fighting this war and we were changing society, that there was really no better off for humanity out of the war, and that desperation people felt. There were so many lives lost, a lot of people walked away as amputees, and their life was permanently altered. There was this deliberate idea of mocking beauty. When we look at art, we often think that most successful art has something to do with beauty, and that's really not the whole story. But Dadaism really flew in the face of that. They wanted people to question, what is the point of art if it's not beautiful? What kind of statement can it say? And they weren't at all completely serious about what that statement was. It was the reaction from the viewer that was more important than what the artwork was actually saying. They wanted to trigger comic relief and disgust and this idea that there is elitism in society. Overall, the movement was incredibly anti-institutional. By submitting things like a urinal or a bicycle, they were basically saying that the institution of a museum had no worth, and the way they could demonstrate that was submitting artwork that wasn't artwork. Normally, in that relationship, you are trying to submit artwork to a gallery to sell it and create a relationship with the public and notoriety for yourself. But when galleries and museums put their trust in these artists and they showed up with these found objects, that understanding, that social context was completely blown open. It was deliberately bad taste and bad relationships and flying in the face of any kind of modern convention. Where did Dadaism come from? Dadaism wasn't started in a studio or in a classroom. It was started probably in a public meeting place like a pub or a bar around 1916 in Switzerland, which was considered neutral territory after World War I. A couple of artists got together and started discussing how upset they were with how society was acting post-war, the winter of their discontent. It was during a time of huge political upheaval. People were not doing well. They lost a lot of their family members. People didn't have resources, and they were coming home with their minds and bodies broken. How do you contradict cultural norms when you're an artist? What kind of political power do you have? What kind of influence can you exert? Well, the rest of Europe was trying to get back to normal and get their feet under them. Dadaism was trying to poke fun at that and ask why it is necessary. Dadaism comes from Dada, the French German term for hobby horse. It was meant to reflect the movement's playful style. In 1916, Zurich, Switzerland was an important place because a lot of artists and deserters and refugees were flocking there due to the neutral territory. A group of people opened something that was called Cabaret Voltaire, which was part bar, part performance art space. They started making work that they deeply cared about, how they were affected by the war and the things that were happening around them. It was the culmination of all these nationalistic and maybe idealistic ideas that they had of who they were and what their culture was leading up to the war, and feeling betrayed by those same institutions. No matter how much Europe tried to portray that it was this civilized nation, they just witnessed the absolute atrocities of what happens when you have a large scale war and what it does to the people and the economy and the culture. Who's left but the survivors, and what do they even have to say if they're so mentally and physically damaged? Maybe not all of them, but the majority of society had trusted the government to take care of them. The people suffered for the government's decisions. The governments that they trusted to protect them just sent them to be slaughtered. So why were we then still supporting a system that fed us to the wolves? Around this time, there was a philosophical movement called nihilism, which in very undetailed explanation is the thought that nothing really matters. And this movement could be questionably part of that. Dadaism wasn't nihilism for its own sake. It really was questioning that if you can take your own people and put them in trenches, gas them, is the irrationality of an honest reaction actually nonsense? Therefore, Dadaism in its own way became a way for the artists to tell their own truth and the truth of society, which is nothing is as it appears to be, and we only find value in what we put value on. The refusal of these norms ended up being the face that these artists portrayed. This rage against society needed faces. I will go over the artists and their work that impacted the movement most significantly. The next couple of artists I'm going to teach you about may have been the first trolls of the art community. Let's talk about the three most influential artists I think that there were from the Dadaism period. I have to start with Duchamp. So Marcel Duchamp, born in France, most known sculpture, The Fountain. If you've never seen The Fountain, I will put it here. This ready-made sculpture is literally just a urinal. Duchamp was on a board that was called the Society of Independent Artists. And the whole idea of this board is that if you were part of it, that you could submit things to be viewed and not really be questioned on it. There were no juries and potentially no rejection. To question the institution, he submitted The Fountain, which yes, was a urinal, under the name of R. Mutt, so they couldn't trace it back to him. He was playing with this idea that the gallery trusted that he was going to send them art, and that by that trust, they weren't going to refuse anything that they sent him. Sound familiar to the war effort? Even though the social contract of the museum is that they would show anything, they rejected the urinal. They refused to show it. And so thereby, even their values were turned against when threatened with something that they didn't see as art. It created this discord within the board that Duchamp was part of. How could a urinal be art? How can we display this to the public and them take us seriously? And in an act of protest, Duchamp resigned from the board. The funny thing is we know this now, but for decades we didn't know that our mutt was actually Duchamp. He kept that secret for a long time. But what was actually important about this wasn't the object, wasn't the artwork, but the fact that if you're an artist and you say something's art, who is a museum to question you? And then furthermore, who gets to decide then what art is and what type of art is shown? By submitting a urinal as a piece of art, something that had a very strong reaction to this community, he was asking, is the idea of art a legitimate enough reason for art to be art? It wasn't a joke for him, and he continued to display these ready-made sculptures or found art sculptures to keep questioning the museums and the public. What is art? And if I say it's art, isn't it just art? Another artist from this time period was Hannah Hook. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. Please feel free to correct me in the comments. Now, why she's one of my favorite artists during this time period is that a lot of her art focused on feminism. She was the only woman that was in the Berlin Dada circle, but she worked with several other well-known male artists. Her signature art piece was what we would call photomontage. I usually refer to it as collage. What makes it specifically photomontage is that she used cut-up magazines and newspaper articles to create her artwork. Part of the absurdity was using things in juxtaposition of the other together to make objects appear very large that are normally small, or very small that are normally very large, or either just by comparison to the other objects that were in the art piece. A lot of what she did shaped how we think about composition today. The men that she worked with, Haussmann, Hartfield, and Grosk, were supposed to be involved in different shows with her, but when the time came, they decided to exclude her. Reportedly, her partner at the time had to argue with them to keep her in the show. And it was extremely valid because she was the reason that they even had this notoriety of a specific style. Her most famous piece is called Cut with the Kitchen Knife, and I'll put it here. And it's really talking about women's domestic behavior. Women is an object within the domestic space. And because of the time, she's questioning German politics and culture. This really mattered because this is an example of art as protest. The newspaper was reporting things that were going on around the world, and she was cutting those up and reconstructing them to say things that were deeply heartfelt to her about women's place in society and if the culture was correct, questioning not just is this art, but is art supposed to say something bigger than itself? Is the meaning more important than how beautiful it is? Or is beauty equal to meaning? And what does that meaning evoke in other people as a form of protest? And we see this in today with our meme cultures. We're really just doing the same thing. We might just be thinking we're sending something really cute or funny to someone, but it's another way for us to communicate without words. And photo montage isn't any different. By cutting up articles about political things that are happening outside of the war, that in itself is its own protest. You're taking journalism and the power of reporting, this idea of a cultural lens, and you're misappropriating it. Not only was she fighting for her rights, she was fighting against her culture, and she was using art to prove that she belonged within the art community. She had to fight for the right to use her own style within a movement that was fighting against these society ideals. So if Duchamp broke the rules by questioning if this is art and submitting it under a fake name, then Hannah broke the rules by not allowing herself to disappear from the movement. And the last artist I'm going to talk about is Hugo Ball. This man put on a cardboard cone costume and walked around on stage making random noises and sounds that nobody understood and called it art. If Duchamp was the first artistic troll, then Hugo Ball might be the first punk performance artist. Now, Hugo Ball was instrumental in Cabaret Voltaire. So we're going back to Zurich, Switzerland, 1916, when Cabaret Voltaire had come together with this group of artists and ne'er-do-wells, according to society, to protest what was going on within the society. Zurich was where Dada was born from, and Cabaret Voltaire was like ground zero for the movement. Dadaism had a lot of writing. My speculation is because writing is usually used to communicate. What better way to confuse people and call into question what is absurd, and if language has meaning, then to make up sounds and words and poems. So Hugo Ball is also really famous for this poem called Karawani, is a poem by name only because it was a series of invented syllables and made up language that he recited on stage. The costume that he was wearing prevented his movement and probably muffled his sound a little. He had to shuffle around the stage to the podium and sometimes needed to be carried off. But he described the act of performance basically speaking in artistic tongues and being blindsided and restricted in movement, going into almost a trance state. There was not a religious component to it, but he had a religious type of experience. And so why is this important? Well, it's that whole thing about language. Language itself can start wars and it can stop them as well. But when you stop using language for the sole purpose of communication, then what is the benefit of having language? Language then becomes performative. And again, it asks that question, is this even art? The aspect of performance art would make it so it was difficult for you to relive this experience. And so it was ephemeral and it was timely and it was important, but also could have existed in a way that nobody actually knew about this movement. But it became poignant enough that a man dressed in a cardboard costume murmuring sounds made it into an art style, along with a woman who made photo montage collage and a man that submitted a urinal to an art gallery under a fake name. These three artists were all breaking rules in their own ways. But what did these rules actually build? So if the point of Dadaism was to communicate civil unrest and nonconformity, and they did that by making art that we question if it was art, then what kind of artistic techniques could have they possibly passed on to us? I'll stop on Hannah Hawk again to talk about photo montage because it was more than just cutting up newspapers and magazines and piecing them together. She was using these photos that were from newsprint and magazines to create a narrative without drawing or painting. Skills that artists would traditionally find that had value and had a skill level that you needed to achieve. Anybody in theory could cut things out onto paper. But it wasn't just collage. It was a lot about what do these two objects look like in relation to each other, also known as juxtaposition. She really played with the size of objects, so things that would normally look small looked comically large next to something that was normally average or large size in the field. And playing with that just added to the narrative. Fragmenting this art style and not using traditional methods was also the way for her to communicate that it was cutting up social norms and serving them to you in a different way that maybe didn't make you feel very comfortable about it. There were also typographical elements, so cutting words out of a magazine, so think serial killer style where you're forming different letters. This was speaking more to culture and repurposing what journalists were putting out about nationalist intention. Remember, in Dadaism, they stopped trusting the government and the institutions that were supposed to protect them. So the institutions like journalism and newspapers that were reporting on things that the government were doing thereby were untrustworthy. So how do you take something that they used to believe as being real and turn it into something that you question? Well, you use their words, you use their language, and you use their photos, and you make a mockery of it by putting it all together in a way that tells a completely different story. By treating these images like the raw materials themselves, the artistic expression became the narrative. And it was often used as a public mirror and political dissent that you can kind of see how propaganda evolved from it. And it was often protesting things like fascism and attacked bourgeoisie ideals of the society. This idea of photomontage was creating tension and political discourse. Pairing images that didn't belong together was the whole narrative point. But the cut and paste photomontage of collage wasn't the only skill or technique that Dadaism brought us. Another one was cameraless photography. It was mostly utilized by Man Ray and Christian Schad. They would take photosensitive paper and instead of putting it in the context of a light and a lens to burn an image onto it, they were placing objects on top of that paper. And they were also doing some funky things within the developer room. Things that we take for granted now when we use Photoshop is our linear burn and overdeveloping things, but you used to have to do that by hand. So in the darkroom, they would create solarization, do almost like an airbrushing technique to make objects look different, and just experimented with this idea of how do we use this medium as photographic paper and our chemical developers to create something that was traditionally meant for photography. How do we use this in a different artistic way? Remember, a lot of this was just taking everyday objects, things that we had comfort in as a society, things that we knew what to expect from, and turning them on their head and making you question, why are you using it that way? So now that you understand the philosophy and history and techniques of Dadaism, next I'm going to talk about how Dadaism broke into other art styles and how it's still represented in today's society. Things that you might find more familiar, even if you weren't familiar with the movement. Even if you've never heard of the term Dadaism before, I'm going to prove to you today that it still has its fingerprints all over our current culture and society. I've talked a couple of times about Hannah Hawk and really her techniques in photomontage and how she rearranged images to create absurd political statements really went on to develop what we think about surrealism now. If you think about things like Dali's paintings and Dali's photographs, it's really heavily influenced by her work about the scale differences between the objects and creating a narrative within the art piece itself, but having that viewer question if it's reality or not. And that's kind of the crux of surrealism. It's not just adding that absurd nature, but creating almost a fantasy world or an alternative universe that we could imagine ourselves being in. I would argue that some of Duchamp's questioning of if this art anymore eventually appealed to graffiti artists, whether they knew that they were influenced or not. Tagging your name on a building or a train may not on its face look like some artistic endeavor, but it's another way to communicate. And if Dadaism told us anything, it's like, what is the power of communication? What happens to communication when we strip language away? And how does showing typical objects like a train change when it has somebody's name on it that's not a brand name? And then Hugo Ball, he was trying to break the rules of society by using language in a way that people literally didn't understand. He was breaking the medium altogether, making his voice muffled, shrouding his body and his face, restricting his movement. He was trying to do everything that a normal speech by a politician would do and flip it on its head. Thereby, he is, by all standards, the direct ancestor of what we would consider the punk movement today. Any art that's built on refusal has some sort of inspiration from Hugo Ball, whether they've seen him or not. Next time someone tells you that a movement made of nonsense couldn't go anywhere, you're gonna know better. Dada's fingerprints are all over our current world and culture. And suddenly, this idea of nonsense makes a lot of sense. Now that you know the basics of Dadaism, what are you going to do with it? Personal philosophies can develop into art styles that we know today. What personal philosophy do you have that reflects in your work?